Can you remember the last commencement speech you listened to? Did you get out of there thinking, that was awesome? Or did you think, man, that was the most boring speech I've ever heard? I bet it's the latter. Well, Miss Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and friends, let me tell you a story about June 12th, 2005. The place was Stanford University in California. The speaker was Steve Jobs, the head of Apple Computer. On that day, June 12th, Steve Jobs proceeded to give not only what is widely considered the best commencement speech of all time, but a lot of people would say is one of the best speeches of all time. Now, what did Jobs speak about? Did he speak about how to get tranquility in your life? No. Did he speak about dishing the inside dirt on Silicon Valley entrepreneurs? No. Okay, then he probably talked about how to make your first $1 million before you're 25 years old. Nope. None of those. In his own words, he just told 3 stories. Just 3 stories. No big deal. That's exactly what he said. If you look around the public speaking world today, stories are everywhere. Just open your Toastmaster magazine. It's all about how to use stories and why we should use stories. Forbes magazine tells us if you want to amp up your presentations, use stories. And there's a well-known blogger out there who has written, storytelling is the most important business capability that you need for the next 5 years. So, why are stories a big deal? Well, they grab people's attention. When you hear a story, you want to listen more. And you want to know. It really draws you in. And the best thing about stories is you can really touch people's lives in ways that presenting facts and figures is never going to do. So when I learned all this, my first thought was, that's great, but how do I do it? After all, if you read things in the magazines, they sort of make an assumption there, which is we know how to tell stories. Maybe you all do, but for me, I just didn't get it. I didn't understand how to tell a good story. It reminded me of my first humorous speech contest that I was in last year. One of my evaluators, this was 2 days before the area contest, my evaluator said, and I quote, "Your speech isn't funny enough. Make it funnier." Thanks, dude. That's really helpful. What I needed was Ken here to help me out, but I didn't have him. And so I went on a quest to learn how to tell stories. I read everything that I could read on the subject. I read books like The Power of Personal Storytelling. I attended workshops of well-known speakers and storytellers like Darren LaCroix, like Craig Valentine, and professional storytellers like Kim Whitecamp and Elizabeth Ellis. And I tried to gather all the information I could on the subject. And I think from all that, I learned a few things that I'd like to try to pass on today. But first, I want to tell a story. Just a story, no big deal. But I'm going to tell it in 2 ways. Let me tell the first version. When I was a kid, one day I went into school and my teacher told us, it was a first grade teacher, she told us to make half a K on a piece of paper. I didn't know how to make half a K, so I wrote a whole K. I got in trouble, but most of the class didn't understand either, so I didn't get in too much trouble. But I had to still tell my dad. So I went home, told my dad. He didn't get it either. We laughed about it. The end. Now let me tell another version of the same story. Do you remember the first time that you realized that adults don't know absolutely everything? Carolyn's looking at me like, they don't? I remember it. I was in first grade. The year was 1967. It was at the Our Lady of Good Counsel Catholic School in Vienna, Virginia. My teacher that year was Sister Thomas Marguerite. She was a tall, stately-looking nun, clothed head to toe in her black habit. And she could be strict. My knuckles remember that. But she was the kind of teacher who you knew that she was strict because she cared about us. Have you ever had a teacher like that? They were tough on you, but you know the reason was because they cared how you turned out as a person. Well, Sister Thomas Marguerite was like that. I sort of idolized her. She was my first grade idol. So one day we're in class, and Sister Thomas Marguerite said, "All right now, class, I want everybody to make half a K." I thought, half a K? What's half a K? But I wanted to make her happy. She was my idol after all. Now you're probably thinking, why didn't you just ask what half a K was? Well, excuse me, have you ever been in first grade? When you're in first grade, you don't want to stand out from the crowd. You want to fit in. And I wanted to fit in with my classmates. I didn't want Bobby Kennedy there, one of my classmates in that room, to think, oh, stupid Basega, he doesn't even know what half a K is. For Bobby Kennedy, that would be bad news.
Yeah.
So I didn't ask, but I wanted to make her happy. So I wrote down the best thing I could do. I wrote down a K, the letter K. Well, with a name like Basega, you're at the front of the row a lot, especially in Catholic school. And so this day she picked to walk down the aisles and check our work. She got to me, and I heard that sound that nobody wants to hear from your teacher. She said, "Mr. Basega, I said half a K. Go stand by the chalkboard." Stupid half a K. Stupid Sister Thomas Marguerite. I got up to the blackboard, and I looked out over this sea of faces looking at me like you're looking at me now. This sea of intelligent, smug, half a K making faces. And they were laughing at me. I felt embarrassed. You ever felt like that? Well, it wasn't long before it wasn't just me standing there. Sister Thomas Marguerite said, "Miss Condon, go stand next to Mr. Basega." And Christine Condon was standing next to me. And then a minute later, Jeff Curtis was standing next to her. And then a minute later, Bobby Kennedy himself was standing up there. None of us had any idea what half a K was. Well, I think she wanted to punish us, but there's a point at which even first graders can become a formidable enemy. And so she dismissed us. But I still had to go home and tell my father. Now, my father is not a cruel man. My father is a kind man. But I have to say, he's pretty good with a belt, if you know what I mean. That's okay. I usually deserved it, so I don't resent it. But I went home to tell him, "Dad, I got in trouble today." "Gary," pulling out the belt, "what'd you do?" "I didn't do what Sister Thomas Marguerite asked me to do." "What did she ask you to do?" "She said to make half a K, and I made a whole K." My dad waited a minute, and then a smile broke out on his face. He said, "What is half a K?" I said, "I have no idea." That was almost 50 years ago. To this day, my dad and I, we still laugh about that sometimes. What is half a K? We still don't know. But my dad did teach me two things that day. One of the things he taught me was that adults don't always know everything. Sister Thomas Marguerite didn't know how what she was telling us would get into our brains. And he didn't even know what half a K was. But the other thing I learned was if you want somebody to do something, be clear about what you want. Ask them what you want them to do. Give them the success criteria. Don't ask for half a K. So that's the second version of my story. It's the exact same story, really, but totally different. Now, I went on my quest, and what I found was a few common points. And I also learned 3 dirty little secrets. Most stories start out like my first story, even from very good storytellers. They're a mere list of what happened. The second thing is, a story is never complete. You keep on working it and working it. And the third point is, there are processes and steps that you can learn, that each one of us can learn, to tell better stories. Now, I only have a minute, so I'm going to just mention a couple of them. But there is great resources out there that you can use. The first thing that I did was, as I looked at my simple story, I thought, what kind of characters are in the story? And these steps, by the way, are given by Craig Valentine, one of the best storytellers I know, world champion of public speaking. Look at the characters in your story. Do you care about the characters? Do you know enough to care? In my first version of the story, all you knew is I had a teacher. You didn't know she was Sister Thomas Marguerite, and she was tall, and she was lanky, and she held a ruler a lot. And she cared about us. Characters are all about making your audience care about your story and care about what you're telling them. I told this story, one of the first times I told this story, I had a gentleman in the audience, 70 years old, an Indian gentleman, a gentleman from India. He said to me afterwards, you know, when I was a boy, I had a teacher exactly like Sister Thomas Marguerite. He was rough, he beat us all the time, but he loved us, and we knew it. And they still correspond after all these years. So characters make people care about your story. Circumstance, the second C. First is characters, second is circumstance. The story became something that makes sense in your life. We've all been to commencement speeches. We know how boring they can be. But we also see what Steve Jobs did, and we were able to relate to what the subject was. Conflict. There's always conflict in a story. At least there needs to be conflict in a story. That brings out what happens next in our audience's mind, which leads to the fourth C, which is questions. Okay, Ms. Grammarian, I know questions doesn't start with a C.
You're getting a flag on that one.
Questions. There needs to be questions in the audience's mind, or else they don't care. We make a mistake if we think that the only question in the audience's mind is, what's in it for me? Audiences do have that question, but they need to have questions about what's going on in the story and what's going to happen. And my last point that I'll mention today is your story needs a cure. It needs the point where you overcome that adversity. And you need a guru. In my case, my guru was my dad. He really helped me to understand and to resolve that conflict. So there's 5 quick C's: characters, circumstance, conflict, questions, and cure. The bad news of all this is most of us were not born storytellers. I certainly wasn't. The good news is that by applying one of these processes that you can read about from people like Craig Valentine or Elizabeth Ellis, we can learn to become better storytellers. And the best news of all is we can improve right away so we can touch more people's lives. Toastmaster?
David, can you give Ken an evaluation? Are you prepared to give Ken an evaluation?